All right, folks, good morning. We're going to get going. I think a couple of other folks will be joining as we get going, but I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you all for joining today. My name is Ryan Zinn, and I am with Grow Ahead. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Grow Ahead and do a little bit of a Agroforestry 101, like we like to say. So today actually kicks off our week of action, and I'll talk about that in a second. I also just want to mention that GrowEd's program manager, Taryn Lemon, is also on, and she's going to be helping out with some of the Q&A and back of the house stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get going, and I encourage you to go ahead and flag any questions or comments you might have in the chat. We'll tackle those near the end of the presentation and hopefully open it up for a good conversation. So thank you all again for joining. So anyways, my name is Ryan Zinn, and I've actually been involved in community development and agroforestry now going on, oh boy, a little over 25 years. I actually got my start in Latin America. And I often think that despite all I've perhaps seen, to be honest with you, I keep learning more and more every day. And so, my sort of experience in agroforestry, I hope will be able to come out during the course of this presentation. And I encourage some of your questions and, comments. Today actually kicks off Grow Ahead's Week of Action. What we've done is really designed a couple of webinars to really dig into both our activities as an organization, but really more importantly, highlight the experiences of our farmer partners. So tomorrow we'll actually be hosting a great webinar with three of our implementation partners, the MST from Brazil, COMSA from Honduras, and Copacoco from Ghana. And really our hope there through a much more in-depth webinar is to give our partners an opportunity to share their experiences in agroforestry and their partnerships with Grow Ahead. And I think it's really a great opportunity to get a window into some of the activities you might see really in a day-to-day agroforestry project in the Global South. And then on Wednesday, we're going to be highlighting a couple of our business partners, including Maggie's Organics, one of the top apparel companies in the United States that really is committed to organic, fair trade, and regenerative certification. And then Paizel Surfboards, who's been a fantastic partner with us. So they'll talk a little bit about their experience with Grow Ahead, as well as some of their sort of sustainability initiatives that they have at the company-wide level. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a great combination session, one with Amazon Watch, and they're going to talk about their role in that of the communities they partner with in defending, native forests like the Amazon, but in particular their partnership with local communities and forest defenders. And then another fantastic presentation with Dr. Lauren Gifford, who is going to be talking about some of the challenges and pitfalls as it relates to conservation and the carbon market to really provide a much more kind of comprehensive view in terms of some of the challenges that we're facing on the ground. So that really kicks off our week of action. Our goal really here is to be able to inform and educate some of our folks in our network and showcase a lot of the experiences, particularly that of our farmer partners on the ground. And as part of this week of action, we're really focusing on highlighting our three active campaigns, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But we have three current campaigns, two of which are in Mexico and one of which is in Ivory Coast. And all three really focus on community-focused agroforestry. And we'll talk a little bit about those details further on into the course of the webinar. And then lastly, I just want to give a big shout out to all of the sponsors for our week of action. We've got some fantastic brands and businesses that have been able to sponsor us through their either in-kind contributions or with financial donations. And then we have great partners kind of in the nonprofit sector. You can see those folks there, particularly in the fair trade world. We are very grateful for both our sponsors as well as our partners for this week of action. And then last but not least, if you'd like to make a contribution, we've got a great set of gifts that go along with any contribution starting at $25 with some fair trade, organic, and regenerative certified chocolate bars from Dr. Bronner's, all the way up to some fantastic t-shirts and other fair trade gifts. So if the spirit moves you, I encourage you to please make a donation, and who knows, you might get one of these fantastic gifts. So we're going to go ahead and kick off a little bit on the background of Grow Ahead. For those of you that may not be familiar with this organization. So Grow Ahead actually started back in 2013. It was a collaboration effort between Cooperative Coffees, which is really one of the more premier organic and fair trade importing roasting coffee cooperatives in North America, and the Progresso Foundation based out of the Netherlands. And at the time in the fair trade coffee world, what we noticed was a lot of fair trade coffee co-ops were actually having a hard time accessing credit. And this is one of the real basic tenets and values of the fair trade movement, which is access to pre-financing. So for those of you that may be unfamiliar with fair trade coffee, one of the big challenges is having enough cash flow to be able to pay farmers for their harvest, because from the time they harvest their coffee all the way to the time that that coffee gets roasted and sold to a customer, you'll actually see several months. And so cash flow is really, really tight, and really it was important at that time to be able to really jumpstart the financing of fair trade coffee. And so what Cooperative Coffees and Progresso did, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time, was create this platform that individuals and organizations could actually help pre-finance coffee through fair trade networks to be able to facilitate that process. And over time, what we found was, the market began to change. A lot of the local co-ops were able to actually access their own credit and their own financing. And as a result, Grow Ahead basically took kind of a backseat to some of the more sort of pressing activities of Cooperative Coffees, Progresso, and the fair trade coffee networks and cooperatives. And then Fairworld Project, a nonprofit dedicated to fair trade, connected with Grow Ahead to really look at a way to be able to take advantage of this fantastic platform and engagement with fair trade producers and figure out a way that we might be able to continue to support them at a different capacity. So that led Fairworld Project, in collaboration with Cooperative Coffees, to launch a global survey of small scale and fair trade farmers all around the world to really get in and dig into what are some of the biggest challenges that they were facing. And so we actually interviewed some 40 fair trade cooperatives from around the world, including other organizations, particularly in those in the Via Campesina network, to really see what the biggest challenges there were. And so what we found out was that there was a number of major issues that were sort of emerging over time, and we looked really as a way to figure out a way to sort of address some of those issues. And that really led us to our sort of revamped mission, which is really to focus on funding and supporting small-scale farmers as they tackle climate change and poverty in their communities. And this was something that we felt really strongly about because it really reflected both the challenges and issues facing small-scale farmers throughout the global South and really around the world. And so as a result of that process, what we found was there was a couple of key things that were missing for farmers to really be able to thrive and grow to the next level. One was capacity building. One thing that we've noticed in really the experience of agroecology and organic from the last 30 to 40 years is that farmers really, learn best from their peers, and really facilitating this farmer to farmer experience has been something that has been proven successful and cost effective around the world, but really from its origins in Latin America to be really scale out very quickly, agroecology and organic, and to do it in a way that really is relevant. So it doesn't make sense for me or others from outside of a community to come in and start talking about organic or agroecology principles, but really to be able to facilitate and convene those farmers together. And the next one is really this issue of climate resiliency. The farmers are sometimes considered to be the canaries in the coal mines, and though we're seeing some of the impacts right now of climate change here, particularly in the US, where we've had massive hurricane damage over the course of the last couple of weeks, farmers have been really facing down climate change over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades in a really significant way. And one of the major takeaways from our survey and engagement with farmers was really needed more funding for focusing on climate resiliency strategies. And the next one was credit. As we mentioned, credit is something that is an ongoing challenge for many farmers, whether that is to maintain cash flow as they focus on harvesting their crops and their production, or that's actually things like investing in infrastructure, those types of things that are really important right now for small scale farmers around the world, in particular value addition, to be able to process their crops and their harvests, be able to sell that to outside parties. And then last thing, one thing that we see sort of as an ongoing challenge throughout the rural communities around the world is this notion of making sure that there's equitable access for women farmers. And that ranges everything from fair payment from their work that they do for their harvest, all the way to access to credit, including opportunities for training. And so Grow Ahead really focused quite a bit in early stages on focusing on scholarships for women farmers. And over time, what we found was the landscape for raising funds here in the United States, it became increasingly difficult to raise funds for things like capacity building or what we consider to be farmer to farmer trainings. And similarly, the sort of marketplace for microloans and others began to shift a little bit. And what we found is that in engagement with our farmer partners is that, one way to really combine all of these values and all of these issues into really kind of one package is this concept of agroforestry, which is planting trees and shrubs together with crops and livestock. And so we'll talk a little bit about those basics there. But over time, what we figured out was we need to really focus on maintaining sort of our values, which was really farmer engagement and ensuring that there's an opportunity for peer-to-peer collaboration amongst farmers and farmer organizations, making sure that climate resiliency was really baked into any type of programming that we do. And then lastly, we want to make sure that women farmers have an opportunity to really engage and take advantage of those programs as well. So really our theory of change in the grand landscape of tree planting organizations, I'm sure you've probably seen them out there. There's probably 101 right now in your Google search feed. The reality is that planting trees has become kind of, a thing of a very fashionable thing, both for activists, for donors, and for corporations as well. And a couple of things that really, I would say, distinguish Grow Ahead as it relates to kind of our approach to community engagement in agroforestry. And one really important aspect here is that all of our projects are really community-led and designed. So we partner directly with small-scale farmer organizations who have a strategy in place to be able to plant agroforestry at community scale. This is not kind of an outside organization in our particular case of coming in and really imposing upon local communities this notion of, sort of tree planting or agroforestry that doesn't quite match both the priorities of the local communities nor the environment with which they operate. So all of our projects that we support are really community-led and designed. And this really actually is one of the key elements or key ingredients for a successful project. I've been on dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of projects with outside funding over the years. And one thing I've noticed, a surefire way to ensure failure is to not make sure that there's proper stakeholder engagement, but more importantly, if they are responding to kind of greater priorities outside of that of the community, it's sure to fail. And really the next step here is a more holistic approach. And that's one of the reasons why we focus on agroforestry, which is really ensuring that we can focus on both the social aspects as well as the ecological aspects of tree planting. And we really think this is embodied in the values of agroforestry, which is really responding to community needs, but also addressing that from a much more ecological perspective. And then the next aspect that we really tend to focus on is really maximizing impact. Like I mentioned, there are lots of international aid agencies, there are non-governmental organizations, and many tree planting organizations. And what we have found in many cases is that the burden placed on implementing partners or farmers organizations in terms of grant reporting and grant applications and grant monitoring, oftentimes the value of that dollar amount really gets eroded as farmers organizations really need to focus quite a bit on staffing up just to manage grants. So really our approach here is to really maximize the amount of impact and dollars that we can provide to farmer partners without requiring what we would consider to be onerous or over-the-top types of reporting or grant applications. So we've been able to really strike a balance, I believe, here in terms of making sure that we do our due diligence as an organization without making sort of unnecessary or I would say excessive requirements of farmer partners in terms of staffing up, making sure that a bunch of those resources that we've provided go to not to impact, but really towards, basically creating overhead. And then the next aspect that we really begin to focus on, and this is in large part sort of in collaboration with our partners, is really focus on funding underfunded organizations. In the sort of grant and philanthropy world, oftentimes what you see is massive grants or private public partnerships that focus on maybe $1 million or $2, sometimes even more. In many cases, small scale farmers organizations, cooperatives, and associations, quite frankly, just don't have the capacity to absorb and manage that type of funding requirements. And with that sort of higher dollar amount, you also see more and more restrictions placed on funding that really doesn't respond to the needs of the local communities. On the flip side, oftentimes what you can see out in the landscape is a lot of micro grants and microloans. And I think those are really valuable, but oftentimes they're not quite enough to get farmers organizations over the humps in terms of actually implementing projects that have kind of a much more lasting impact. So what we found is there's kind of this sweet spot between microloans and mega donations and grants, that really respond both to the farmer organization's needs, but also don't require so much in terms of reporting or due diligence on that side. And then lastly, really what we focus here is primarily on partnering almost exclusively with organizations that have a strong foundation in social justice. One of the big challenges that we're seeing in the tree planting world these days is that many of those initiatives and campaigns really don't focus on the needs of the communities or respond to their biggest challenges. And as a result, ultimately, I don't believe that they're successful. So as a result, our focus primarily is partnering with organizations that have a strong commitment to democratic organizations and social justice, and making sure that their communities are fed and resilient. And so I just want to talk about sort of like the two main categories of our partner organizations. First, we've worked primarily, the majority of our projects have been with organizations and farmers cooperatives throughout the Fair Trade Network. These are organizations that have a long track record of being able to produce under fair conditions. And that's really important to us. We want to make sure that any type of planning that we do really takes the community organizations into account. And I think one of the best pathways to do that is to the Fair Trade Network. And we've worked with a number of farmers that have focused either on sort of those types of cash crops like coffee and cocoa, but others that have worked on other crops as well, really focusing on local food security. And then the other sort of network of organizations that we work with is La Via Campesina, which is a global federation of peasant farmers that have really focused primarily on not only structural change in the rural economy, but really focusing on this concept of food sovereignty, which really goes above and beyond what we can sometimes hear about, which is food security. Food security is just the ability to be able to feed yourself with the right number of calories per day. But food sovereignty actually looks at sort of the relationship with land and territory, and making sure that that landscape actually not only sustains and feeds communities, but does so in a way that's culturally appropriate and is much more sustainable over the long haul. And what we have found is by partnering with these two networks, sort of our success rate is pretty significant. And I also feel that the impact is quite a bit higher. So just to give a quick sort of like rundown of our work over the last couple of years, we've been able to really mobilize over $1 million to fund a number of tree planting programs in collaboration with local communities and organizations that have a pretty big impact. And so we really hope that we can begin to continue our model going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those examples later on. So here's one example that we wrapped up last year in collaboration with a fair trade cocoa cooperative in Ghana, Kwapa Cocoa. And they've been working with really tens of thousands of small scale farmers to really transform the landscape in Ghana. One of the things that we've noticed is, West Africa, particularly Ivory Coast and Ghana, are responsible for from 60%, if not more, of the global cocoa supply. Nonetheless, they are in a very precarious position. Climate change is really one of the main hotspots in West Africa. So as a result, they're facing not only very high temperatures, crop loss due to unseasonal rain. So this combination of high rain and drought at the same time sometimes can really wreak havoc on farmers' ability to be able to produce. And they've also been dealing with the fact that, in many countries, farmers have been really, I would say, the victims of what I would consider to be bad extension and bad incentives, in large part because chemical companies and governments have really focused on funding and prioritizing small-scale monocultures or just one crop to the detriment of the environment and to the workers as well. So Kwapa Cocoa came up with a fantastic campaign of which we were just one partner to be able to support farmers as they transition to really small-scale monocultures, just one crop, in this case, cocoa, to diversifying all of their farms to not only focus on feeding their local communities, but also being much more climate resilient. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those aspects later on. And then lastly, I just want to talk about really our funding model. We basically rely on two streams of funding. One is individual donations. Those form really the backbone of our contributions to all of our partner projects, but also really partnering with what I would consider to be ethical, fair, organic companies that have been really fantastic in terms of supporting our mission over the years. And they do this for a variety of different ways. And you can see those on the right. All right, and on to the main event. So What in the heck is agroforestry? I would say, in general terms, oftentimes it's really a simple concept, and that is sort of like trees and shrubs integrated deliberately with crops and livestock. And one way to really think about this term is like kind of breaking it up: agro, which is oftentimes farming, and then forestry, which is largely trees. But for really the last maybe 50 to 60 years, or at least since the beginning of the Green Revolution, there's been this kind of like artificial divide when we think about landscapes, that agriculture is just annual crops like corn or wheat, for example, and forestry is just something you do for things like producing timber or pulp. And really, agroforestry is this sort of fusion between these two concepts to be able to create a much more resilient, productive landscape. And I should say, it's been pretty amazing the last couple of years. Agroforestry is kind of having this really unique and exciting moment. I remember back in the 90s when I was in school, the concept of really learning anything about agroforestry was pretty uncommon. You either had a hyper focus on maximizing production for annual crops like corn, for example, or you had folks that were just quite focused on what they called then natural resource management, which was just extractive practices of, forestry, and the paper products mill. So that would say I'm really encouraged by this moment of sort of this agroforestry moment, which we're having right now. And we wanted to really place this, sort of like concept within the sort of current age of climate change. So oftentimes, what we think about when we think about climate change is either like smokestacks on the left, or oftentimes vehicles like cars, internal combustion, et cetera. But oftentimes we overlook the fact that industrial agriculture has a major contribution to climate change, accounting upwards of about 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that has really spiked since the onset of the Green Revolution and after World War II. As farms get bigger, they became increasingly mechanized and depended upon things like agrochemicals and fertilizers to be able to survive. So when we think about the future, we think about climate change, agriculture certainly needs to be a big part of this conversation. And so that really is what our point of departure here is at Growhead. We recognize that industrial agriculture is not only a driver of climate change, but one of the biggest drivers of rural poverty and malnutrition around the world. And our sort of working theory here is that small-scale farmers can not only address both the climate crisis, but they can also address the biggest challenge, globally, which is global poverty. And this is really backed up by the science. For some of you that might have seen some of this work not that long ago by Project Drawdown, they listed out the top 100 tactics to be able to tackle climate change. And not surprisingly, land use and agriculture was in the top 20. And so you see everything here from management and safeguarding the tropical forests to silvopasture, which is the incorporation of livestock, all the way down to tree intercropping and diversified agroforestry. So really, we're looking at this combination of focusing on based on science, but also based on community as well. And really, agroforestry has very, very deep indigenous roots, despite the fact that it's starting to emerge as a concept and strategy in recent years, both in terms of agriculture and academia. This concept of agroforestry actually goes back many, many thousands of years. And we can see this in examples both here in North America, in my home state of California. There's some fantastic examples of indigenous peoples maintaining natural landscapes, particularly through perennials or crops like trees, for example, that sustain for many, many years, to be able to sustain their communities, what we now call ecosystem services, but it's things like ensure that there's habitat for pollinators, for example, and really to utilize the natural world in a way that is much more focused on balance and reciprocity. And what's really fantastic about sort of this deep roots here is that there is this sort of traditional ecological knowledge in communities all around the world that could really provide a pathway and understanding on how we might be able to rethink food and farming in an era of climate crisis. So when we think about agroforestry, it's really this fusion of trees and shrubs with crops and livestock. And there's a couple of different ways you might be able to look at it, or I should say different applications. The most obvious one, of course, is food production. There's this idea, these food forests, which basically are able to produce food in a way that is much more productive, but also in a way that really responds to the needs of local communities. And so that is probably, I would think, one of the biggest takeaways when we think about agroforestry is the ability to produce food and even cash crops like coffee and cocoa, for example, in a way that's much more balanced. And there's other aspects of agroforestry as well that we can't overlook. It's the production of things like fiber, fuel, in the case of firewood for many communities. Some 700 million farmers rely on firewood to be able to heat their homes and fuel their cook stoves. And so agroforestry and trees can certainly provide that resource as well. Timber is really an important aspect. Construction is really critical, especially for rural communities. Having access to that within an agroforestry system is something that's really valuable. But not to overlook the fact that you have other elements like medicinal plants, fodder for livestock, and farm fertility. And so this is an example where you can actually grow your own fertility by the proper integration of different crops that produce biomass or nitrogen fixing for your farm system. And the last, you have things like industrial applications like resins and latex, which can both provide inputs for local communities and businesses, but additional sources of income for farmers as well. So here's just kind of a little overview or a snapshot, I should say, of like what this looks like in real life. You have in this concept of agroforestry, a very common one, which really is this idea of strata or levels. And the idea here is for farmers to really design for diversity, but really to capture all of the different levels that each crop likes to sort of grow in. So for example, you have ground cover, things like turmeric or ginger or taro that can grow under shade. You can also grow things like biomass trees or species there to be able to sort of feed and regenerate the system. In this particular case, this is an example from West Africa. So you have cocoa trees in the next strata. They're a little bit more shade loving and in fact thrive with proper shading. And so as a result, they're in that next strata. And then you have other things like food crops, like fruit trees here, everything from bananas, citrus, avocado, and breadfruit, all of which are kind of a way to balance out the system to ensure that you can in fact feed communities while they also produce cash crops like cocoa and coffee. And then lastly, as you go up and up and up into the canopy of things like coconuts, which are a little bit higher, and then timber and shade trees. And so really the idea here is to maximize photosynthesis and ecological niches so you can get the most out of your farm or your market garden. And this is something that has been developed over many, many years by farmers. And now that we're seeing more and more scientific data, the opportunity to have like wider spread deployment is much higher. So here's just a couple of examples of what you might see in an agroforestry system. As there's many, sort of approaches one might take, and that's a large part dependent on many factors. The most important of which is what sort of the local ecology can sustain. But on the upper left, you have a concept called civil pasture, which is the incorporation of livestock with trees. And this is a really kind of growing and I would say re-emerging concept of really balancing out the production of meat and dairy, for example, or eggs with that under the canopy of trees. And as a result, what we find is that animal welfare is quite a bit higher than in pasture, in some cases in feedlots. And it is a way to actually circulate and recirculate nutrients in a way that is much more ecological. And we've seen some fantastic studies out of Colombia, for example, that really look at two key factors here, which is productivity. They're able to see a massive increase in milk production at the same time sequestering carbon. So, this is one perfect example on how we might rethink agriculture in a way that is much more ecological and it really maximizes animal welfare. Another concept here is alley cropping, as you can see in the upper right. And that's really a very simple concept, which is planting annual crops, everything from like wheat, which I've seen in many countries, with perennial trees. That could either be nut trees, for example, or timber trees. And this is a very simple way that farmers can really maximize their production on their land. And in the bottom left, this is an example of a very fantastic multi-strata agroforestry farm. As you can see there are a number of crops and species there, and they all occupy different levels of production. And so this allows for farmers not only to be much more balanced, but also they can actually produce more and generate much more income, which is a big challenge. Oftentimes, when farmers just grow one single crop, one monocrop, like let's say coffee or cocoa, they're really at the they have to ride the roller coaster of the marketplace. And so if coffee goes up or coffee goes down, ultimately that might depend upon if they're in poverty or not. But if they're able to actually diversify their system, they can not only withstand the market roller coaster, but they can also deal with some of the climate change habits as well. And on the right, here's another example of a much more, sort of like simplified system. But as you notice, you actually have what's on the ground. This is like grass and biomass with some leaf litter. And really the goal here is to make sure that you can actually continue to build your own fertility without having to buy inputs from off the farm. And this is a big challenge for farmers as they look to sort of balance out their balance statement, whether or not they are looking at making sure they can actually make money as opposed to maximizing their yields. So I just want to talk about two different examples here on how we might think about agroforestry in the context of one specific crop. In this case, it's coffee. Everybody, I should say, most people drink coffee, but oftentimes it's really not clear exactly where that coffee might be coming from and how it's produced. So on the left-hand side, you can see an example of a coffee monoculture, which is hundreds and hundreds of hectares of one single crop, which is coffee. In this case, it is sun-grown. And so as a result, the farm is really reliant on things like inputs in terms of like irrigation and fertilizers and pesticides. And in many cases, it's actually mechanized to basically take that human element out of the equation. And as a result, what we get is a landscape that is pretty sterile in many regards. There's not a whole lot of social positive impact. And quite frankly, the quality of the product isn't so great. And on the right, here's a perfect example of a fantastic under-end organic agroforestry system where you can see the coffee cherries coming into the bloom and maturing there. But it's also grown under several layers of canopies. And so this allows for the right light exposure for coffee. But it also ensures that farmers are able to work in a comfortable environment and be much more resilient in the face of climate change. And so we talked a little bit about some of the different sort of aspects here, but here's a graphic we are able to create through Grow Ahead that gives you a couple of ideas on how that might play out. Certainly our sort of number one driver when we think about communities and the rural landscape, particularly in the global south, is to ensure that they actually have income and food security, to ensure that they can put food on their table. We've been able to partner with a great organization called Food for Farmers. And really their mission is to focus on ensuring food and income for farmers during the off season, right? And so you harvest your coffee, you get some income, but you have to really rely on that money for the rest of the year. And so in an effort to really balance out the rural economy, we're looking at different ways to be able to sort of provide food and income throughout the year, not just relying on one crop. So that's a perfect example there. But some of the other aspects that are absolutely critical and sometimes overlooked is this notion of biodiversity. Certainly we know from the bird-friendly promotions and campaigns that agroforestry and tree cover provide great habitat for migratory species like birds, for example. But it's also habitat for things like pollinators that are absolutely critical as well, just for the survivability of the farm and production aspects. And so by building in those design aspects, farmers are really able to sort of balance out the need for social, economic, and ecological priorities. And I think the other aspect that is oftentimes overlooked is the fact that you can actually plant for your own fertility. And so in a diverse agroforestry system, not only are you growing your own fertilizers, but you're able to sort of build in buffers to counteract things like pest and disease. And this is something that has really emerged in the last couple of decades. In large part, it's been supercharged by climate change. So just a 1 or 2 degree change on a farm can have a massive impact when it comes to pest pressure, things like insects or fungi. And at the same time, 1 or 2 degrees can actually change the flowering stages of different crops, which can really wreak havoc on farmers and make it really challenging to have a very successful farm. So there's many elements to agroforestry that are mutually beneficial both to farmer and to the local ecology. And I just want to really highlight 2 aspects here that I think are really important to talk about. Certainly, if you were to Google the benefits of agroforestry, you'd find that there is quite a bit of research that is emerging and work that's been done over many, many years that really speaks to the benefits, both from a social and ecological aspect. But there's 2 aspects that I really wanted to highlight here today, just to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the benefits and something to think about going forward. And the first one is just an example of just one, peer-reviewed paper, which digs into the aspect of climate change adaptation, through agroforestry. And this is something that we've seen really emerge in the last, I would say, 20 years. One of the first papers I saw came about comparing two, sorts of communities in Central America as they responded to hurricane impacts there. And what was found in that particular case, I believe it was Hurricane Mitch, was that agroforestry systems based upon agroecological practices really were much more resilient in the face of climate change, in this particular case, hurricanes, than their quote unquote conventional counterparts. And so in many cases, what we're seeing is that those diversified farms can not only adapt to a changing climate and these climate shocks, things like heat waves, for example, drought, and massive rains, but they actually can perform better compared to their counterparts. So this is ever increasingly important as farmers all around the world are facing massive challenges. And this is something that we have seen really in the last 2 years that I think is really important to underline with 2 specific crops. Last year, there was a massive crisis both for olives as well as cocoa. And so as a result of a whole host of climatic issues in West Africa, we saw the cocoa production go down and the market basically go into total disarray. And so those cocoa crops or those cocoa fields that were just small monocultures, they fared far worse than their diversified counterparts that was able to actually build in fertility, shade, and resiliency into the system. And then similarly, in the case of the Mediterranean, where they saw a combination of heat waves and drought, conventional irrigated olive trees really lost productivity as compared to their dry land agroecological agroforestry approach olives. So as we look towards the future that's hotter, sometimes drier, sometimes wetter, all in the same year, we really need to look at strategies that can be both adaptive, but also can sequester carbon through agroforestry. And then the other aspect that I just want to underscore, which I think is really important and oftentimes overlooked, is this idea of intercropping that really allows farmers to be able to maximize their production on their field. So as you can see here, there's 2 examples where you have kind of this artificial division between grains and fruit trees. And of course, on a 1-to-1 basis, this may produce more grain or more fruit if you were just using monoculture, but mixed together, you actually get much more production on the whole. So not only is this important to feed a growing population, they make sure rural communities have access to food, but it allows us to really, hopefully, take land out of production and rewild it in a sense and really increase the production on that land that's most suited for agriculture. So these are 2 aspects that I think are really important as we look forward to the future, and I think agroforestry has a really important role to play. So I think, when we look as big picture policy priorities, agroforestry needs to be at the table for sure. On the right-hand side, these are a couple of statistics that I pulled from the Project Drawdown report, and it speaks to the fact that utilizing degraded land around the world, agroforestry has the capacity to sequester massive, massive amounts of atmospheric carbon and put it back into the soil where it belongs. However, this comes with a cost. And so to be able to do this requires a fair amount of investment, but over time, the return is quite a bit more. So as we think about addressing the climate crisis as well as rural poverty, we think there needs to be a combination of these things. And I think agroforestry provides a fantastic approach, one of many to be able to be considered and should be funded. So we've talked a little bit about all of the fantastic ways that agroforestry, when done properly, can actually have huge impacts, positive for both rural communities and for the environment. However, there are some significant barriers to addressing or to implementing agroforestry. Nonetheless, the primary one in many cases is cost. For those farmers looking to transition to a much more diversified agroforestry system, on average, you're looking at about, I don't know, anywhere between $1,000 and $1,500 per acre to make that transition. So that includes everything like seedlings, land preparation, labor. And as a result, I don't believe we're actually making great progress in converting monoculture farms to agroforestry, in large part because cost is a barrier in some cases. And that's really where Grow Ahead comes in. That's really where we focus our effort, is to be able to support farmers in that transition with overcoming that first barrier, which is cost. Other aspects are much more structural in some cases. Land access is a big challenge, particularly for women farmers who are barred systemically from owning or operating land, despite the fact that they do much of the labor. And so if we're able to think about how do we transform the rural landscape, certainly making sure that farmers have access to land, both here, in the United States or North America, but also in the global South, is absolutely critical. But certainly beyond that, there's other interesting things to consider. Access to credit continues to be a big challenge for small-scale farmers organizations. Certainly access to fair markets. Farmers are continue to be paid poverty wages for their harvest. And that's one of the reasons why we've worked through the fair trade system, is to be able to really bolster that system and hopefully scale it out faster. A couple of other aspects as important to highlight before we get going is access to labor. This is something I've seen really kind of get worse in the last 10 to 15 years or so. As farmers are aging out of farming, it's really challenging to find young people that A, want to take over the farm, or B, want to work on a farm. Farming is not the most glorious job, at least when it comes to access to income or payment. And so as a result, people are leaving the countryside and going to the cities in search of opportunities. And then the last three issues here are really important as well. One is what we call capacity building, but fundamentally, there needs to be more farmer-to-farmer training to be able to really scale out agroforestry at a much faster rate and have a bigger impact. And so training is really important here, particularly since the last generation or two of farmers have been really given a lot of bad advice when it comes to farm design, particularly by pesticide companies who are much more active in the rural countryside than you can imagine. And then lastly, discrimination, industrial expansion are really important. One, discrimination, women continue to have fewer access to resources, access to land, and often get paid less for their harvest as well. And then lastly, industrial expansion. We're seeing a huge push in converting industrial and extractive entities, things like deforestation, mining, and cattle ranching, particularly in places like the Amazon, but also to a similar degree in the Congo. In these last sort of major, contiguous farms, or I should say forests, this is having an impact not only on the land and the neighbors, but it certainly is having a big impact on the climate as well. And so as we focus on supporting and partnering with local and small scale farmers, we need to stop this industrial expansion and the footprint of industrial agriculture. And then lastly, I just want to highlight some of the big challenges that we face going forward. There was a big study a number of years ago called like 1 trillion trees. And the idea was, if we planted 1 trillion trees, we could be able to turn back climate change like almost overnight. So I think it was kind of an interesting thought experiment, but nonetheless, it was one that sort of had some unintended consequences. There's been a couple of cases where countries around the world have had these massive tree planting campaigns. And then the reality is that they're not very successful, right? Because of the same reasons we've spoken about before. Certainly stakeholder engagement, they don't respond to the local community's needs. There isn't the technical capacity in some cases. And as a result, it's just a massive waste of resources. And on the right, I would just want to share with you kind of a great summary compiled recently by Manga Bay, a fantastic online news source that includes many aspects that we work on, including agroforestry and traditional indigenous knowledge. And it really focuses on the kind of key recipes for a successful project. And we do our best to really make sure that we incorporate all of these values. And it's something we get through our evaluation and monitoring program to determine how do we continue to improve our programming. So of course, having access to, good quality planting material is important, long-term focus in terms of not just planting trees for something like carbon credits, for example, and making sure you're planting the right tree in the right place. This is something that I've noticed a lot lately where a lot of tree planting campaigns will focus on planting exotics or trees that just quite frankly don't belong in that environment. And as a result, the project isn't successful. So with all of the promise that there is in planting trees and in agroforestry in particular, there remains a number of barriers and challenges to really making sure that this happens at scale. And so with that, I want to go ahead and wrap up. This was a very quick overview on Grow Ahead and agroforestry. I encourage you to take a look at our website. We've got some great resources there, including summaries of all of our past projects, just to give you an idea and flavor of some of the projects that we've done and some of the projects that we are currently working on. And there's opportunities there to get involved as well. And certainly, if you're more interested in agroforestry, you can visit growahead.org or reach out to us directly. We've got plenty of resources there, and we are building more of those resources out each day as we wrap up more projects and have more resources to share. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. I'm going to turn my video on here. Thanks so much for that overview. I think a lot of folks aren't super familiar with agroforestry as a means for supporting communities or combating climate change. So I think that was so interesting, and especially for folks who maybe haven't even really heard of agroforestry before. It's a great overview. So some of our questions are really revolving around our current projects. So could you just give us a little bit of, quick, we've only got 12 minutes here. So just a quick rundown of our 3 current projects, why we chose those project partners and those locations as well.
Yeah, great question. So I think in our particular case, our criteria, like I mentioned, is really to start with those organizations that have a really strong kind of social network. One of the things that we find is most successful in agroforestry project is to have a solid organization to be actually do the deployment. And so by having that engagement with farmers, this type of skin in the game really is important for a successful project. So that's really kind of our point of departure. So in our particular case, our most recent projects that we have actively right now, 2 are based in Mexico, and they're actually connected to a sort of long-term organizational process that involves La Via Campesina organizations. One is in the Yucatan Peninsula, Cacushtal, which is an organization of indigenous farmers that really are focusing on recovering and restoring landscapes, in large part because they've faced down mostly deforestation and cattle expansion. So as a result, what they want to do is be able to sort of really recover a lot of the ancestral knowledge when it comes to agroforestry and food production, and really matching this combination of meeting local needs by restoring land as well. And so that was really our first choice of our campaigns, in large part because they've got a proven track record. They've got the resources, or I should say they've got the capacity to implement the project, but in some cases, all that's missing is this financial aspect. So that was the first one we kicked off earlier this year in the Yucatan Peninsula. And what I really like about that project is that it focuses really on 3 things. One is this sort of idea of restoring degraded land by planting native species for really, I would say, biodiversity reserves, in large part because the communities understand that without those reserves, they don't have pollinators. They don't have that sort of interaction between wild and domesticated plants to be able to have a buffer against climate change. And at the same time, they're also recovering native varieties of corn, for example, that are much more adaptable to a changing climate and can respond to the needs of the communities. The second project in Mexico is on actually the Pacific coast in the state of Guerrero. And there we're working with a fantastic community that is is really focused on recovering, I'd say native or local varieties of coffee. Coffee is not native to Mexico, but nonetheless, it's been in production for many, many years in Latin America. So that the crops in this case are pretty locally adapted. Latin America was hit with this coffee rust called La Roya, probably going back some 20 years or so. And Guerrero itself was not spared either. In large part, they're facing down the fact that some of the community was forced to cut down some of the shade trees to be able to sell as timber. And so the idea here is to renovate a lot of the coffee production land by growing, multi-strata agroforestry. So that utilizing some of their more heirloom varieties of coffee, but also producing things like timber and shade so that they can actually safeguard against the expansion of this rust disease. So that's really an interesting approach because a lot of the farmers in Latin America have really taken a big hit when it comes to La Roya. And I think this approach is really likely to be successful. And then the last project is a women's cooperative in Ivory Coast called Cani. And what was really fantastic about this project, in addition to my own personal experience interaction with working with them, is that it really is focusing on bringing women together to ensure that they are paid fairly. Ivory Coast, as in many countries, women are not allowed to actually own the land, despite the fact that they do the majority of the work in this particular community in terms of cocoa production. So first, the idea was to make sure that they were able to get access to fair payment for the work that they do, but then really over time, begin to regenerate and rebuild the rural landscape that is much more reflective of an agroforestry system. And so in this particular case, they've got some of the elements, for example, being able to sell organic and fair trade and regenerative certified cocoa beans, but to be able to have access to financing to be able to regenerate their land has been missing. And so we chose to work with them because they got fantastic investment and buy-in by the local community. They're able to really rethink how they might approach agroforestry in a way that meets local needs. But one of the elements here, of course, is missing financing. So those are really kind of the overview of the three projects that we've got going on right now.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. And I put a link in the chat for our Week of Action webpage that has links to each of the specific projects as well. So if you wanted to go do a little bit of a deeper dive and see some of those specific impact numbers as well, which I think are really impactful for us to see, how many farmers are affected, how many trees will be planted with this project, and so on. You can find those on that webpage. In the last 5 or so minutes here, Ryan, I want to ask one more of the questions that we have. And if we didn't get to your question, feel free to send us an email or, reach out to us in some way after this. But how can we as non-experts differentiate between legitimate tree planting projects and organizations like Grow Ahead and non-legitimate, some of these failed projects that you've seen so many of? How can we differentiate just at face level when we're looking at a website or, getting a newsletter or something from another organization?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I would say a difficult question. I think some of the big challenges that we're facing in this space is figuring out how to be as transparent as possible in terms of like all of the information that we would like to provide to current and prospective donors, of course, and make sure that that information is valuable and honest. But for an average person looking to make a contribution, I think really utilizing the framework established by Manga Bay has been really, I think, very useful. What's great is that they've created a clearinghouse for all of the tree planting projects that they've been able to evaluate. And really, they're looking for a couple of main things. One, it is what they call stakeholder engagement, but is how do you interact, with the implementation partners, or in this case, on the organizations on the ground doing the work. In our particular case, we chose to work exclusively with organizations that are dedicated to farming, in large part because this is the work that they do. I think, that there is a valuable role for ecosystem restoration. There's certainly a lot of work to be done there. But in my humble opinion, I think it's the actual practitioners who actually have skin in the game, which is small scale farmers. When they are the people that doing the actual work themselves, the chances of a much more successful project are really quite a bit higher. So that would be one sort of point, the jumping off point. And then I would just say, in general, looking at how companies or how organizations really report what their activities within reason, but of course, like what's really their theory of change, and is there a social component? In our particular case, we chose to really make sure that farmers' livelihoods are a critical component to any of these agroforestry projects, and as a result, they are the best equipped to be able to implement, monitor, and expand these projects.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great answer for sure. And for folks looking to, you know, buy responsible products and stuff as well, there's always the fair trade folks that we're working with and beyond. And I did want to mention as well, going kind of back to our current projects, our Ivory Coast project, Kani, they are the main provider of cocoa for Dr. Bronner's All One Magic chocolate bars, which is a pretty cool thing to be part of. And with a $25 donation during the week of action to Grow Ahead, you'll actually get 2 of those chocolate bars. So you can learn about Kani throughout the week and then actually taste some of the cocoa that they're producing, which is pretty sweet. And in a really, again, responsible way to support tree planting and social projects. Well, with that, we've only got a couple minutes left, so we can sign off here. I will send around a follow-up to everybody that's registered and joined on with a recording if you want to come back and take another look or go over something maybe you missed. And some of these links will be in that follow up as well. But yeah, thank you so much for joining on, everybody. And I really appreciate your time. And Ryan, thank you so much for the presentation.
Yep, thank you all, and please join us the rest of this week. We've got some great programming, and we're always available for answering any questions at growhead.org.
Great. Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.